I'm struck by the verb that they use when Jesus died in Mark's gospel. Mark says, then he bowed his head and he gave over his spirit. Surrender is different than resignation. See, resignation of the spirit, the bully has you pinned and finally you say, I give up. See, that's not surrender. Surrender is you're giving it over in love.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we could make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Few spiritual writers have traced the human journey with as much honesty and depth as Father Ronald Rolheiser. His trilogy, The Holy Longing, Sacred Fire, and now Insane for the Light, maps the movement from getting our lives together to giving them away, to finally giving our deaths away. In this conversation, we explore how faith matures with time, how the energy of youth gives way to the wisdom of surrender, and how helplessness can become its own form of grace. Father Rolheiser talks about the difference between resignation and surrender, about showing up when we feel nothing, and about how love is sustained not by emotion, but by presence. We also talk about how aging as a spiritual practice is moving from bitterness to gratitude, control to trust, and learning to grow transparent until the light shines through. So join us for a conversation about fidelity, surrender, and the beauty of a faith that holds even when all our images of God fall away. Here is my conversation with Father Ronald Rolheiser. Father Ronald Rolheiser, welcome to Shifting Culture. It's an honor to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Joshua. It's a pleasure being with you. Okay.
Your new book that's coming out, Insane for the Light, it's a spiritual journey for our wisdom years. It's the third of your trilogy that started with The Holy Longing, Sacred Fire, and now here, Insane for the Light. Can you take us on a little bit of the journey of, let's go back, Holy Longing and Sacred Fire, and what are these, the arc of the human journey? What does it look like, and what are these struggles?
Yeah, well, let's begin this way. Like in Christian spirituality, we haven't, sorted out so much like that, that this is spirituality for Sunday school, this is for adults, this is for retired people, and so on. And notice you don't see that in Jesus. Jesus just has a set of teachings. But the difference is this: we hear them in different times of our lives. It's one thing to hear a parable when you're 7 years old, another thing to hear when you're 17, when you're 37, and you're 77. And that's why we need to break this down. The structure I use actually comes from the great Christian mystics. And it's spiritual structure. It's also psychological or anthropological. They'll say, and this makes perfect sense, you have three great struggles in your life. The first one, the struggle to get your life together. From the time you're born till you land in your 20s, sometime, who are you and how do you get your life together? But then you have about 50 years, generative years, I call them, where you're in that right now, where your struggle is to give your life away. At our age, the biggest struggle shouldn't be who am I and how do I find myself and how do I serve better and so on. But usually Christian spirituality, popular spirituality, ended there. Then you're expected to die, but you need another one. And that is, how do you live your old age in such a way that these have a different kind of generativity? In fact, the image I use is this. You have Abraham and Sarah, and this is an incredible story. They said, when Abraham was 80 and she was 70, God said, I want you to set off to a distant country. And when you get there, she's going to become pregnant. So they do. It took 20 years. Now when he's 100, she's 90, they have Isaac, So we always say, like, what's going to be your postmenopausal pregnancy? Like today, a lot of people are retiring 65, and they're going to live healthily for 20 or 25 years. What are those years for? And then also the concept they use in the book is the same as right now, you're trying to give your life away through service. In those latter years, you got to give your death away. Your death, as Henry and Allen used to say, it's the last greatest gift you make to your community. So the books are, The Holy Longing is basically how do you get your life together? Sacred Fire is how do you give your life away? And this book is how do you give your death away? What's the spirituality for retirement and post-retirement?
So as we walk through these struggles and these journeys, you're going to suffer. You're going to have difficulties. As I'm in this time of service and giving my life away, I'm also going through darkness and suffering and times where I feel like I don't have anything in me to give away. God is obscure to me. What happens? How do we walk through those struggles and be attached to divine love in the midst of our suffering?
Couple of things there. You actually put your finger on something that's very important. I think that in Christian spirituality, we haven't been able to tease that out well for people. So, we can talk about it later, but just like dark nights or something. But if you say like, what's the meaning of this suffering? Well, first of all, and this is part of what I have in this last book. Sometimes when you're helpless, when you have nothing to give, that's when you have the most to give. Let me use the example I use of Jesus, and I don't think we've ever teased that out properly, but when we talk about Christ's passion, the passion of Jesus Christ, we normally think of his sufferings, and the Pilate and the whips and so on, but that partly misses the point. If, passion here comes from the word passio, means passivity. If he said, this is the passivity of Jesus Christ, like for instance, if you read the passivity of Jesus Christ according to Matthew or Mark and so on. And the rest of the time, you could talk about the activity. When you look at all four Gospels, you'll notice this. Up until Jesus is arrested and they bind him and walk him away, he is the active. Notice he's teaching, preaching, doing miracles, doing all this stuff and so on. And after he's arrested, he doesn't do anything anymore. Everything's done to him. So he becomes passive. They lead him away, they bind him, they put him on trial. Pilate carries his cross, they nail the cross. Now, this is the interesting thing. We believe we are saved more by his passivity than his activity. We are saved through what Jesus taught us, but we're saved preeminently by his dying for us and so on. And now that isn't just some theological mystery. It is. But, like for instance, in our helplessness, in your passivity, sometimes you can give more than you can in your activity. A friend of mine, this woman tells a story. She said her father was an alcoholic, and he said his alcoholism completely destroyed our family. So by the time he died, said we were 5 siblings. We couldn't live in the same house or the same city with each other. So then my mother, for years, tried to reconcile us. She'd bring us together at Thanksgiving and do stuff. Said, and it didn't work. Said, then my mother died of cancer. And during the last week of her life, she was unconscious in hospice. Says, and the family gathered around her. You know what happened? They reconciled. When she was unconscious and couldn't do anything, she was able to do what she couldn't do in her activity. That's true of Jesus. Jesus tried for 3.5 years to get his message across, and they didn't get it. He died, and they got it. That's a great mystery. And so when you're in your generative years, and you're struggling with faith, with tiredness, with this and that, and so on. And I teased that out in the book, the Sacred Fire, that, those generative years, they're going to be long. In fact, John of the Cross, the great mystic, says, it's going to be the biggest problem in your prayer for about 30 years of your life. He said, flat out boredom. Basically, and you expect that, he said, because at that age, that the deeper things are happening under the surface. When you're in fervor, when you first converted, you're walking on water and so on. It's all, but that's a honeymoon. That only lasts. You come home from a honeymoon. Then you have 30 or 40 or 50 years where, I hate that verb, you're kind of grinding it out, but you're not grinding out because what's happening is deeper things are happening under the surface. On a honeymoon, stuff happens on a surface. That, and then also your helplessness. When you're tired and down and out and you want to quit and you show up, maybe that tiredness is going to color your work in such a way that it's much deeper and more powerful. Or I'm sure, Joshua, you ever gone to a funeral, a tragic thing, and you have nothing to say, and you just hug the person? You're sharing your helplessness. That's the most powerful thing you can do. You say a few words, but they're completely unhelpful. Basically, your helplessness is what speaks. and what heals. So Jesus in his helplessness was able to do something for us that he couldn't do when he was the great helper. It's interesting to say in Mark's gospel, all the verbs about Jesus in Greek before he's arrested are active. He taught, he walked, he did. And after he's arrested, they're all passive. They bound him, they led him away, they scourged him, they questioned him. Passivity and helplessness, that's a big part of that last book.
That passivity and the helplessness, if you're talking about the boredom, John on the Cross says you're praying it's going to be boredom during this time. It feels like there's generative things to do, but if you say something's like deeper underneath, like the things that are happening are really underneath the surface, is that the passivity that's happening under the surface while you're being generative in your life? What is going on there that is actually forming us into this creature that looks more like Jesus?
Okay.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening and thank you for supporting the show. If you'd like to support the show and get early ad-free episodes, you go to Substack at shiftingculture.substack.com, and with your subscription, you could have a private podcast feed in your podcast app where you get to download early episodes before anybody gets to listen to them. You could also support the show by going to the support the show link at the bottom of the show notes in the app that you're using right now. That goes to a page that supports the work my wife and I do around the world. That donation is also tax deductible. So if you want a tax deductible donation, you could go there. Or if you want to support the show by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really helps new listeners find the show as well. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you so much for supporting this work so that we could see the body of Christ look more like Jesus.
That's part of it. Let me give you the example that I use with students in class. So imagine this. Okay. Imagine your mother is in assisted living, okay? And you are the dutiful son. And you happen to be living 5 miles away. And so it falls on you, and 5 or 6 nights a week, you go and spend an hour with your mother. She's eating her dinner and so on, and spend some time with her. And you do this day in, day out, year in, year out. How many times during the course of a year do you think you'll have an exciting, interesting conversation with your mother? Once or twice? And the other times you're talking about the weather, the sports team, the politics, and and sometimes while she's eating, you fall asleep for 15 minutes, you wake up and so on. Now, contrast that. You have a sister, and she is conveniently living in Alaska. Okay, so she doesn't have to come 5 nights a week. So she comes once a year for a couple of days, and her and your mother are having conversations. They're crying and hugging each other. You want to kill them both. Okay. Now, is what your sister has, is that deeper than what you have? No. That's fervor, See, when your mother dies, you're going to be closer to her than anybody, because, the words have been spoken. Then presence is everything. You are with her. And if you fall asleep, that's okay too. Therese of Lisieux, the saint, she once said, somebody asked her, is it wrong to fall asleep when you pray? And she said, no. She said, a little child is equally pleasing to her parents, awake or asleep, maybe more asleep. No, your mother knows you're tired. You're there. See, so that during these generative years, that's the thing. Your task is to show up for prayer, for service, for family, and so on, day in, day out. It isn't always exciting on the surface. That fidelity, that's the essence of contemplative prayer. Another example I often use in a marriage homily from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great Lutheran and martyr. He was a priest, and when he married people, he'd always tell them, he said, today you're young and you're in love, and you think your love will sustain your marriage, but it can't. But your marriage can sustain your love. See, your fervor isn't going to sustain your prayer. It isn't going to sustain, but your commitment can sustain that. See, you stay in a marriage, or you stay in a church, or you stay in service on the basis of commitment. You're going to visit your mother 5 nights a week and so on. See, then your emotions, they move in, they move out. Some Sundays you're better in church. Other Sundays you're looking at your wristwatch and so on. It doesn't matter. You're there, you're there. The basic ultimate rule for prayer is simply show up. show up.
So it feels like if it's the show up, it's about presence and being with
Yeah.
more than the whatever the activity is, but it's the presence of God with us, even if we don't have that emotional high before, or even if we don't feel his presence, but the actual like withness of God.
See, love is sustained through a commitment. So I'll give you an example. So you take a married couple, okay, and they have a little ritual practice. So every morning before they leave for work, they kiss each other and say, I love you, okay. Some mornings, emotionally, they don't mean that. But actually deeper down, they do mean that. That's why they're staying together. See, that separates your emotions from the depth in faith. So faith is, some days you show up for church, you don't want to be there. So, but yes, you do at a deeper level. At a deeper level, that's I'm going to give you a colorful story. Remember, that the writer Annie Lamott.
Yep.
Annie Lamott, right out of San Francisco, and but she tells this story. I love this, her color. She says her son Samuel said, "I raised this kid. I virtually raised him at church." Said, and then he said he gets to be 13, 14. He comes one Sunday and he says, "I don't want to go to church anymore." And she says, "Why not?" I said, "I don't find it meaningful." So you know what she said to him? She said, "I couldn't give a shit whether you find it meaningful or not." She says, "That's a kid's answer." She said, "It doesn't have to be meaningful to you. It's meaningful in itself." So it's like visiting your grandmother. You don't visit your grandmother because it's meaningful to you. It's meaningful. That's what you do, And I like that. Like you don't go to church every Sunday because it's meaningful to you. You go to church every Sunday because it's meaningful. You don't show up to pray every day because it's meaningful to you. It's meaningful. These things mean something beyond you. And like you said, just presence, showing up, visiting your mother, or the ritual, a couple of kisses. I love you. Some days they want to kill each other, no, but deeper down, they love each other, See, and in that sense, that's what Bonhoeffer meant when he said the ritual will hold you. The ritual will keep you in love. Love won't keep you inside of a marriage. A marriage will keep you inside of love.
I mean, it's good. A couple of weeks ago, as we were sitting around having a conversation, my wife said, I have the spiritual gift of showing up. And the people that were there were like, you have so much more than just showing up. And she wasn't actually like denigrating herself. It's what she commits, and she shows up, and she's there, and she's present. And I think what you just said will encourage her that it is a spiritual gift to show up. It is the commitment to be there day in and day out as hey, it is meaningful, even if you're not finding meaning and purpose at the moment. When you show up, this is what God has called us to give our lives away through service.
That's the ultimate spiritual gift, fidelity. When Martin Luther King was being buried, I was a young seminarian, and I remember a statement. They were interviewing some people, and they said to this old black fellow, they said, "What does it mean to you?" He said, "He was a faithful man." He said, he believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves. He said, he always showed up. Basically, that's fidelity. He was a faithful man, Notice faithful and full of faith. It's the same word. Faithful, you show up. That's the deep faith commitment underneath. Your emotions go up and down and up and down. I always tell people, if you're only going to pray when you feel like it, you're not going to pray very often. You pray when it's time to pray.
As we move out of that service time and then move into our wisdom years, and you distinguish between the elderly and becoming an elder. What makes that difference as we're moving into our wisdom years? Shifting culture is only possible because people believe these conversations matter. But to keep this show going, we need partners who will invest in it. Advertising on Shifting Culture not only sustains this community, it connects your message with an engaged audience that cares deeply about shaping a better world. If your mission aligns with ours, lifting up stories of hope, justice, creativity in the way of Jesus, then sponsoring this podcast is one of the best ways to make sure these conversations continue to reach thousands each month. If you're interested, email me at jjohnson@shiftingculturepodcast.com or follow the link in the show notes. And if you know someone whose organization should advertise here, please connect us. Together, we can keep this vision alive.
Well, it's interesting that you should ask that. In Christianity, and that's not a disparaging remark, Krista, we've never really developed a program or a spirituality for our later years. And the reason we didn't is because we didn't need it. People used to die young. You wouldn't believe this 100 years ago or 105 years ago. In 1919, the average age for an American was 49. So if you're dying by age 50, you don't need much of a developed spirituality. Today, it's 76 for men and about 86 for women. So we need to develop this. But then also there's stages. We have a program here, we call it forest dwelling. Okay. We stole the title from Hinduism. In Hinduism, they say there's a stage between retirement and becoming a true elder, and they call it forest dwelling. So it's almost like, when you finished high school, you went to college to prepare for life. They said, no, when you retire, you should go back to college. You should have some years to get ready so that you enter in our program. We'd say, Joshua, we want to work with you. Now, right now, you're transitioning. You're transitioning from a certain kind of generativity to work you've done for 40 years. How do you become the holy old beggar? How do you become the Christian martyr and so on when nobody wants to kill you? So that it's an interim stage where you say, like, you have to learn what am I being called to? Like Abraham and Sarah, what's going to be your Isaac? What Isaac are you going to give birth to when you're 75, 80, and 90 years old? See, right now your generativity is clearer. You're a married man, you have kids, you're doing a job, you're paying a mortgage and so on. That's good. That all ends at a certain point, and then you might live another 25 years. So what are they for? See, you're not, when you retire at 65 or 70, you're still not an elder. You're old. It's basically, how do you become that holy old fool, the holy old beggar? How do you enter into Christ's passion? That your passivity, your diminishment in old age, that's going to be a great gift to the world.
So how do we? You're saying that, yeah, what's the path for us?
We got a 2-year program for that, There's certain things to it, like, let me just list a few, and I can list them as principles. They're not that like, for instance, I have 6 movements. I said one of the movements, you have to move from bitterness and anger to gratitude. From bitterness and anger to gratitude. Morris West, the Australian novelist, he wrote an autobiography, which he published when he was 75 years old. It's a great little book. These are the first words of the book. He said, when you get to be 75, there should only be 3 phrases left in your vocabulary. Thank you, and thank you. If that isn't your dome, then you have a lot of inner work to do. See, as we go through our youth, and you pick up some scars and unfairness and all kinds of stuff, and it's so easy to age into a bitter, angry old man or old woman and so on. So that our first task is, you got to move towards gratitude, where when you're 75 and you write your autobiography, you got to say, thank you, and thank you. It's interesting when you look at the 4 Eucharistic words of Jesus. Said, receive, give thanks, break and share. He doesn't say receive, break and share. Like, real love has to come out of gratitude. Or one of the stories we use is, and maybe your readers have read that, in 1997, Frankie McCourt, a United States American, wrote this famous book, Angela's Ashes, in which he, it's a brilliant book. It's funny, but a book with a lot of lamenting, poor me and this and that and so on. And well, Andrew Greeley, other second-generation Irishman, he wrote a review on that for Commonweal, and it was a very good review. He said, stop with the whining. But he ended the review by saying this. He said, Frank, he said, you and I are both Men now at 70 years old, said, we're soon to face our maker. Both have died since it. So I'll give you some advice. He said, before you die, he said, forgive your father for his alcoholism. Forgive your mother that she couldn't protect you. Forgive the poverty that you grew up in. He said, forgive yourself for becoming an alcoholic and ruining 2 marriages. He said, then forgive God because life isn't fair. He said, so that you don't die an angry, bitter person. He said, because that's the only moral imperative there is. That's a good line. We always tell people, when you get a little older, you can slim your spiritual vocabulary down to 2 words, gratitude and forgiveness. You don't want to exit the planet bitter, angry, because we're supposed to be at a banquet table with everybody. A friend of mine, a theologian, I love this expression. He says, the heavenly banquet table is open to everyone who's willing to sit down with everyone. So if I die and I can't be at table with these other 10 people, we can't have separate tables in heaven. Otherwise you have earth. The biggest thing is, spiritually is to let go of anger, of bitterness, and so on. We don't get angry when we get old. I was once at a psychiatrist conference and someone asked a psychiatrist, they said, how come so many people get angry when they get old? It never happens. Stood up in 40 years, it never happens. And I think what you're talking about is an angry person getting old. See, the anger is always been there. It just comes out in spades, The next one is also as we get older, certain things happen. You're more marginalized culturally. You're more marginalized in terms of power. Oftentimes, there's physical stuff, physical disabilities and so on that beset you, okay, and so on. Like to handle those in such a way that they deepen and mellow your soul rather than make your soul bitter. James Hillman has a great image. He has a book on aging, and he says, starts the book, he says, why does God or nature design life in this way? That just when you get to the peak of your mental powers, your body starts breaking down. Okay, you're in your 70s and so on, and now that's the peak of your powers, and then you're seeing a doctor every day, And he has a great image. He said, you know why? He said, the best wines have to be aged in cracked old barrels. He said, that's mellowing your soul. See, and the same, even right now, like you said, when you're tired, so that's mellowing your soul. In fact, I'm in my late 70s, and one of my mentors, and I used to be president of a school and our general counsel in Rome, and now I have no power. Whenever I say to myself, like, let it go, let it go, let it go. It's just basically, you're no longer there. You got to accept that, you become more marginalized. You're stepping away, and the same with physical ailments and so on. When you're in assisted living, something, it's a great way. I'll put it this way: when Jesus says, "Become like little children, you can enter the kingdom of heaven," he wasn't talking about the innocence of a child, which you can't imitate. He's talking about the helplessness. When you're in assisted living, you're helpless. You're a child. You die, you go straight to heaven. You have no illusion of self-sufficiency. Again, with the story, I like illustrating the story. A priest friend of mine, I went to the funeral of his dad, and his dad died at age 90. And he had been a strong man, very successful. In high school, the captain of the football team, everything, and then he very successful, raised a big family, big company, always in charge of everything. And he died at age 90. So his son, who was a priest, was preaching at the funeral, and he said, here lies our dad, died at age 90, and Scripture says 70 is the sum of a man's years, 80 for those who are strong. He said, no, he left the extra 20 years. Why? He said, no accident. He said, it took God another 20 years to mellow him out. He said he was too cantankerous and strong to die at 70 or 80. He said, but the last years of his life were years of massive diminishment. His wife died, broke his heart. Then he had a stroke. He needed a walker. And then he had another stroke. And then he was bedridden. He said by the time he died, he said he could take your hand and say, help me. He said he couldn't say that since he was 7 years old. Like he said, when he got to the other side, he just said, help me. He said, 10 years ago, he had told St. Peter, let me tell you how to run this place. There's a lot of improvements you should be making here, what John of the Cross calls the dark night of the spirit, like that. Well, he said you can enter that proactively but mostly it's going to be done to us. What he's that's what the dark night of spirit looks like, diminishment, so on. And see, our task when that happens, we can become bitter and angry, or we can let it mellow our soul.
I think that's beautiful. And you write in your book, to grow old is to grow transparent until the light shines through.
Yeah.
And that feels like that mellowing journey, the journey of letting go and surrendering.
Yeah.
Feels like, oh, I can be transparent. Is there a way to structure or to include elders in communities, faith communities, so that the wisdom of elders, as the light is shining through, we could start early with gratitude and forgiveness and letting go while we're still being generative and full of service? How can we incorporate elders, not put them to the side, but have them integral to the life of a faith community?
Well, you put your finger on something important. That's what should be happening. Sadly, our culture is moving the opposite direction, where we isolate individuals. The aged, they go to their own place, and they have gated communities and assisted living and so on. And, I lived in Italy for 6 years, and there, at least back in the, 25 years ago, most of the elderly still lived with their families. I think that's healthy. Well, we don't have anymore. We don't have 2, 3 generations in the same family in the same house. See, so we are separated from our elders. I mean, not entirely. So we see some of it still with grandparents. Anthropologists. I taught anthropology, and they said that grandparenting is the purest experience of love on this planet. It trumps. They said, with your own kids and your own spouse, you're so close. There's always tension. There's always some tension. With grandparenting, it's perfect. And see, as when you become a grandparent, you'll be able to give your grandkids a blessing in such a way that their parents can't quite do. So there's wisdom. There's also blessing. I write on that in Sacred Fire and so on. But the problem is, you've put your finger on the problem. I don't know what the solution is, since we put our elderly into homes, and so consequently, they get penalized because they don't have contact with young people, and we get penalized that we're not getting their wisdom. And even living with their eccentricities is healthy for us. Living with a cranky old uncle, or grandfather, it's like a stone in the river. The water has to go around them, and it makes less smoothness, but makes for character. Our culture is missing something by not having, grandparents and elders and stuff in the house. And maybe we have to get more deliberate, say in faith communities of, setting up evenings, or something where you bring people from seniors' homes and young kids. I just did a workshop in Tucson, Arizona. I do a lot of workshops, but this one, it was organized by the youth group, but they brought the older people there. And it was one of the more interesting things I've ever been to. So it was organized by if the old had organized, tried to bring the young, they wouldn't have come. But the youth organized, they brought the old, and it was a wonderful intergenerational experience, for both, But see, I think we need to do things like that. We need to proactively set those things up, because right now in the culture, we have apartheid.
That's true. We do. We also have a culture where we have a bunch of billionaires trying for anti-aging, don't want to get older. They're trying to stay young forever. They're actually even moving towards transhumanism, like, hey, we want to be more than human. What would you say to a culture that is moving towards that end? What is the gift of aging for us, and why, as humans, we should embrace it and surrender and trust instead of try to go the opposite direction and stop it?
It's interesting. There are some pretty good books written on that. Already a generation ago, no, I'm trying to think of his name, Denial of Death, Ernst Becker wrote a book like, he said, we're in a culture where we deny death. It's just, we don't think about it. It's not going to happen. And he said, we pay a price for that psychologically. And then earlier Heidegger, the great German theologian, had written a book, Being Unto Death, in German, Sein zum Toden. But basically, they say that you pay a price. Now, they weren't speaking spiritually, but you pay a price psychologically, and that's this. So let me give you an example, like Heidegger would have. Imagine, Joshua, that you have a very dear, dear friend coming, and you're going to meet him at the airport. He's between flights, and you only have 2 hours. So you know what's going to happen? You're not going to enjoy the 2 hours because you're looking at your wristwatch. God, 15 minutes ago. See the fact that you're not facing the fact that it's only 2 hours, you don't enjoy the 2 hours, And see, they're saying that there's this unconscious thing that the fact that we're afraid of dying, actually, we don't live our lives the way we should. I'll give you a personal example. I've been a cancer survivor now for 14 years. And in 2014, and I'm healthy now, but, my doctor told me you have 2 years left to live, And I got a second opinion. He said, no, that's optimistic. You don't have 2 years left to live. So I wrote myself a creed, but basically, something, these 700 years have been the best years of my life. My life is dealt out to me now in 6 months increments. Go to cancer. Well, you're good for 6 months. We can't guarantee anything after that, and so on. But that makes for a great 6 months. You no longer take life for granted. You no longer take anything for granted. See, when you don't accept mortality, which is part of our human nature, it's the way God built us, then we're there's going to be something wrong with our psyche. Now, when we're younger, you should think you're going to live forever. But you get to an age where it's important to face your death, and it'll make your life richer. Otherwise, you're still gearing up to live. But plus, I wish them luck. They're not going to get 200 years. And if you do, they're not going to be great years anyway.
Looking back at your earlier work, looking back at the Holy Longing and Sacred Fire, has your understanding of discipleship matured as you've entered into this last final stage of reflection? Is there anything that surprised you? Is there anything that has matured looking back now from this vantage point?
Well, I never asked myself that question. It's partly just off the cuff. I'd say no, because it kind of like you're growing. These 3 books are also a story of my own growth in life and so on, so that you will, and they're written over a period of 25 years. I wrote The Holy Longing in 1997. I wrote Sacred Fire just a year or two ago. So that's 25, 30 years, I'd have to think a little bit to answer the question, like, what do I see differently now than I saw, say, 25 years ago, or even 30 years before that, when I wrote a book called The Restless Heart, like as a young person, 30 years old, about struggling with youthful loneliness and so on. I guess I would still say everything I said there, I would still stand behind. It's not that I'd look back now and say, Holy Longing, well, I wrote some stuff that was the young me and was immature. It may well be immature, but it would still be immature, but I haven't had like some breakthroughs of consciousness where I thought, no, I didn't realize that. I think probably the biggest piece is the cancer diagnosis the last 10 or 15 years, where you're facing, like certainly for the last, since 2014, 11 years, I see doctors every few months and they say, well, you're going to be it for another 2 months or whatever. That I think has changed me and put a different perspective to life.
Do you think that has changed the way that you follow Jesus in your life? Or has it changed into like every day as a gift? I'm going to receive the gift that God has given me. How do you think that has shifted even your own discipleship journey?
On first, with the Jesus thing, I am praying now much more consciously to be ready to accept my death when it comes, that I want to do this with dignity, with faith, with whatever, like Paul says, to cross the finish line. So I pray for that every day. And also, it's made me a whole lot less scared of death. I'm scared of the process of dying, but not of death itself. I think that it's made me in my prayer much more confident in Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit, and so that you almost look forward to what's going to be there. I don't look forward to the process of getting there. Like dying process in any way from cancer or whatever is uh, in fact, sometimes we have a little joke, like to say, like, how do you want to die? I said, I want to die like Archbishop Romero. I want to be shot in church, like it's over in a second, not die over 2 years of cancer and the body decaying and so on. But no, it's definitely brought me closer to Jesus and less afraid of death, more looking forward to meeting Jesus. Um, and my prayer right now is a whole lot intentionally, like, make me ready for this when it comes. Ivan Illich, the great philosopher, he once said, I always pray, he said, and let me not miss the hour of my death. Amen. I don't want to miss the hour of my own death. So that's part of my daily prayer now. But the center there is Jesus, kind of like.
What do you think the role of beauty and silence and contemplation play in learning to see the world with elder eyes?
Very important question. Like beauty, I just want to call him on that. Remember Dostoevsky said, the world will be saved by beauty. So let's look at beauty first. Beauty, we say God has four attributes, four transcendent attributes. God is one, true, good, and beautiful. So by beauty, you are actually, you're honoring God. God is the author of all. So that's important. Silence and contemplation are important, but they need a nuance. Okay, let me talk about that. Meister Eckhart, a famous mystic, once said, nothing so much approximates the language of God as does silence. He said, it's God's language. And there's some truth in that. There are certain things of soul, inner work you can only do in silence. But, and while particularly the Catholic Church and mystics have always pushed that, I say you have to also be careful with that. And that is that we need two things. We need silence and we need community. So that silence can make you deep, but it can make you deep in sick ways. The Unabomber lived in silence. Silence can also make you weird. See, your interaction with people grounds you. It basically it keeps your sanity going. So you need a healthy interplay with family, with community, and so on. And then you need to be able to pull away. I worry today about our culture where someone's got a phone in their hand 24 hours a day, they're grounded, but there's no depth and so on. I push silence, but with that caveat saying, but also make sure you have good interaction. Too much silence and aloneness can make you weird. and too little of it can make you superficial and without depth. That's the paradox. You need silence for depth. You need community for grounding, for sanity.
I mean, we live in an individualistic society. We see isolation of older people. There feels like the community aspect is more difficult to engage with in those times. The silence is probably easier to engage with.
Yeah.
How can people outside of the individual person, how can I see personally people that need community, that have been silent for too long, and move towards them? How do we as a culture move towards each other in community instead of being isolated and alone and individual?
Well, it comes back to your other question again about you're right. It's just, but today our problem is we've isolated these things. We're doing apartheid. The young live in one planet, the old live on another planet. So I think we need to do some kind of proactive, intentional, setting up things, whether it's a Bible study or a dance night or something where it's going to have to be programmed because it's not happening naturally anymore. It used to happen naturally. They'd live in families and so they're participating in family life, Now they're given a cat to smoke in there and so on, which is better than nothing. Even like in ministry, that you get young people to volunteer, to go in, to spend a few hours with these people and so on, as a ministry.
You did say, and we've been talking about this a lot in this conversation, that faith at the end is not clarity, but surrender, the willingness to stand inside the darkness and call it light. So my question is, if faith is finally about surrender, the end, what does it mean to live and to die with our hands open?
Okay, you got a lot of pieces there. Let me break it up. First of all, let's start surrender and work back to faith. I'm struck by the verb that they use when Jesus died in Mark's gospel. Mark says, then he bowed his head and he gave over his spirit. Surrender is different than resignation. See, resignation of the spirit, the bully has you pinned and finally you say, I give up. See, that's not surrender. Surrender is you're giving it over in love. And that's the final move that you got to give yourself over. But notice, you are giving yourself over. Nobody's twisting your arm. It's very important to distinguish surrender from resignation. Say, I'm old, I have nothing to live for, I may as well give it over. So when I said, no, that's an act of faith. Now, the second thing about faith, and again, this is a piece we try to work with, a big piece with forest dwelling, and that is, I think we often mistake faith for the images we have of faith. I'll give you one of my little analogies here. I always say, imagine this. Imagine you're a mother fish at the bottom of the ocean, 300 feet down. And these baby fish come up and say, Mother, what is this water everybody talks about? Okay, you're 300 feet down in it. How do you give them? Well, today the mother fish could set up a power projector and show slides of water. Niagara Falls, the water tap, a rain. And these fish would be very intrigued with these pictures of water. But notice that's not water. Those are pictures of water. At a certain point, the mother fish would turn off the projectors. You've seen the pictures. That's not water. Just sit in the water. Let it flow through you, See, that's faith. See, we can confuse faith with the pictures and with fervor. I believe it, and so on. It's not that that's bad, but that's not faith. Faith is it's something beyond that. And that is why precisely sometimes you get these dark nights where you say, I don't know whether I believe anymore. Something? They've shut the projector off. All the pictures, the images we have of God are not God, they're pictures. So I'll ask you this question, or ask you your people. Imagine you come home from some church service or something, and you really feel like you'd walk on water. Jesus is real and so on. And some other night you wake up in bed and you stare at the ceiling and say, I don't know if I can believe in God. I can't imagine God existing, Does that mean once you have a strong faith and once you have a weak faith? No. It means once you have a strong imagination and once you have a weak imagination. See, God is ineffable. You can't imagine God. You can't speak for it. You can know God. And so as we get older and mature, a lot of times the fervor, the images become less helpful to us. And it can be very disturbing. You say, God, I used to be able to walk on water and now I can't, No, you're moving more into the projectors shutting off. Now you're just sitting in the water, as Paul says, in him we live and move and breathe and have our being. Or I think Luke said that. As we get older, we have to understand the dynamics of faith. The mystics call that dark nights, where basically, and that's the opposite of fervor. Fervor is real. It's good. Usually when people first, when we're young or we're converting and so on, you can get some periods, and they say God gives that to you. That's to get you started. That's your little honeymoon in prayer and so on, where you can walk on water, and then the longer you go, the more at a certain point that disappears, and now you're just visiting your mother, and you trust that deep things are happening on a service, and then like your wife, you just show up, and that's the depth of it, We tend to confuse faith with the imagination. I can imagine God. I can picture God. Well, first of all, you can't, because God is infinite. I always tell students, I'll tell you what, think of this. Think of the highest number it's possible to count to and tell me what it is. You'll never get there. See, and infinity, it has no beginning, it has no end, so you can't circumscribe it. To think God, you'd have to circumscribe. So theologians say, you can know God. You know God, but you can't think God. We can think of images of God. We can have a slide projector on and say, this is this, but always this is a PowerPoint presentation. Even Scripture is a PowerPoint presentation, an inspired one about God. God is still like faith is it's underneath that.
And so this conversation has been incredible. I have a couple of quick questions here at the very end that I like to ask. And one is, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Good question. I would give this. Stay with it. Stay with it. Whatever commitment, make a commitment. And first of all, make some commitment. Today, a lot of people struggle to make a commitment, like commit, whether it's to a marriage, to whatever. And then unless it's completely dysfunctional, so stay with it. Stay with it. Just don't leave it because, well, it's not fulfilling and so on. Keep showing up in your faith and so on. Keep going to church, keep praying, not because it's meaningful, because that it means something. It's meaningful itself. Stay with the rituals. Ritual has held me, That's why I so much like that line from Bonhoeffer. He said, your love isn't going to save your marriage. Your marriage is going to save your love, See, and your fervor isn't going to save your faith. The rituals are going to save your faith. Going to church on Sunday is a ritual. And you just keep doing it, and that's going to save us. And some Sundays you're in it, some Sundays you're not. You're back, you're forth.
Yeah, that's so good. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I'm always reading something. Right now I'm actually reading the letters of Dorothy Day, the great Catholic worker thing, which pushes me in terms of the poor. I'm an academic, and I teach theology students, and we have street people come here and I give them $20, but I don't think that's what Jesus meant about having real contact with the poor and so on. But books that theologically, let me recommend a couple. Are you familiar which is, they're popular and they're deep. So they're popular and they're not simplistic. Are you familiar with a woman called Rachel Held Evans? Evangelical, sadly died at age 37 or 38, from a reaction to an antibiotic. But her books, I would recommend to anybody of any denomination. She's good. As a Roman Catholic, I also like Richard Rohr's writings and so on. Probably just in terms of books that have some depth and are accessible. There's no sense of like some of the theologians, they say read Karl Barth. Well, you can't read Karl Barth. You need courses on these people, but I'd say read Rachel Held Evans.
Excellent. Well, and same for The Light. Your new book is available anywhere books are sold. You go. What hope do you have for this book? What would you like to leave your readers with?
Well, first of all, it's part of a trilogy. I want people to have a structure for spirituality. But with this, it's as we're aging, there isn't a lot out there for us. They're kicking you out of the culture. They're trying to get you into a senior's home. They're, all your power and stuff is gone and so on. And I say, like, those can be the best years of your life. And you can still, it's interesting, Abraham and Sarah, they had their real kid when he was 100 and she was 90. Maybe your real Isaac, maybe what you really need to give to the world, Josh, is only going to happen when you're 80 years old. Like right now, you're doing some important and good work. But who knows what the 80-year-old Joshua can give to the world, So read the book and contemplate what's going to be your postmenopausal pregnancy. Or how am I going to, or just more practically, how am I going to resist getting angry and bitter as I get older? How can I understand aging so I don't get angry and bitter as I get older and get more marginalized?
Excellent. Well, Father Ron, thank you for this conversation. It was fascinating. It was deep. I really pray that a lot of people would get something out of it so that they can actually surrender, give their deaths away, that they could move into a place where they could grow transparently so the light can shine through. So thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. and prayers for your own work, Joshua.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out. Share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.